Once you've got a drawing open to a template you want to use, the first thing I recommend you do is set up your grid and snap values as well as your limits. Like all drafting settings, they can be changed once you've started drawing, but I find them most helpful when first starting a drawing. The grid drafting setting controls the size of the grid you see here and can be quickly toggled on and off by clicking its icon in the status bar or pressing F7. To adjust the grid size, I'll right-click on the icon and select Grid Settings. This brings up the Drafting Settings dialog box open to the Snap and Grid tab. The grid settings are displayed on the right and allow you to adjust its style, spacing, and behavior. Notice in the Grid Behavior section that Adaptive Grid is checked. This will actually scale the grid up depending on your zoom level. So if you want the grid spacing to always display the same, you'll need to uncheck this option. Any value can be typed into the spacing, but notice that the X and Y value will always update together to stay square. To use a non-square grid, you'll need to set these values to 0, which will then use the snap spacing values here for the grid lines, even if snap mode is off. When snap mode itself is on, it will restrict the cursor to the snap spacing while a command is active. Note that this spacing doesn't need to match the grid spacing, though I tend to find it a bit confusing when it doesn't. For this lesson, I'll set the snap spacing to 0.5 for the X spacing and 1 for the Y spacing, while using a grid spacing of 1. I'll click OK. Make sure both drafting settings are on by making sure their icons are blue, and enable the line command from the Draw panel. I'll zoom in a bit, and notice that the mouse jumps around the drawing area according to the snap spacing I set up earlier. I'll press F9 to turn off snap mode, and the cursor is once again free to move anywhere. With that setup, I just need to define my limits. Limits in AutoCAD will define your drawing area and what Zoom All zooms to, but it isn't restrictive unless you set them up to be. Let me show you. To define them, I'll type limits and press Enter. I'll type 0, 0 to define the lower left corner, then press Enter, and define the upper right corner as 20, 20. I'll use the Zoom All command to zoom to the limits. But notice that they aren't easy to see. To get a visual idea of where they are, I'll bring up the grid settings once again and disable Display Grid Beyond Limits. Now when I press OK, you see exactly where the limits are. By default, this is just a guide, and you can still draw outside the limits if you want to, which is great for notes. If you want to restrict your drawing abilities, however, you can do so by re-enabling the Limits command and selecting On from the command prompt. Now if I enable the Line command and try and place a point outside the limits, nothing happens. Taking advantage of the grid, snap, and limits can really help keep your drawing focused and to scale as you get started.